Hi, everyone, and this is Mercedes Samudio, and I am excited to talk to you all today about a topic that is very important where we are right now in our current society, and that is talking about racism and racial bias. I feel very honored to be bringing you this information, and I hope that it is useful for you, your family, and whoever else is able to listen in to this talk. Today's objectives will really talk about a few things. It'll talk about how racial bias may be learned at different ages. We'll also be talking about strategies to help children deal with racial bias. We will also dive into how parents can confront their own bias. And we'll also be looking at tips for talking about racial differences and racism for both people of color as well as Caucasians. Just a little bit about myself before we jump in. My name is Mercedes Samudio. Like I said at the beginning of this talk, I am a licensed clinical social worker in Southern California. I'm also a parent coach, a speaker, and a best-selling author. My book, Shame-Proof Parenting, came out in April of 2017, and it is available right now on Amazon as a hardcover, a paperback, and an audiobook. So I encourage you to check that out. I am also the founder of the nonprofit Diversity in Parenting Incorporated, where we really talk about supporting professionals and being more mindful of what it means to work with diverse types of families and diverse parenting identities. I really love helping parents and children feel good about themselves and connecting. One of the things that I started, I would say maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, was the hashtag end parent shaming. And it really allows us to really take a look at what it means to shame parents and how that shaming really influences the way that they support themselves and support their families. If you're interested in learning more about me, there's my website, shameproofparenting.com, and I'll talk more about how to connect with me later on in the presentation. So let's just talk a little bit about racial bias at different ages. Racial bias is a form of implicit bias. Implicit bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. Thus, racial bias is when you have a bias against someone that is due to their race or their cultural identity. Children begin to learn about these racial differences and some of this racial bias from an early age. And a lot of what they learn is from their parents and the adults around them. Children are like sponges, and I know we've heard that before. And so, what I often talk to families about is how important it is to be mindful about how we talk about other racial identities and how we talk about people who look different than us. Because children really, really begin to understand what differences are in terms of race and gender and identity based on how we, as the adults in their lives, talk to them. The process of learning racial bias is kind of like learning a new language. You can kind of view it as if you have a child that's raised in a bilingual home versus a child who learns Spanish in junior high. The child who is raised in a bilingual home really begins at an early age to just kind of pick up on the nuances of their language or whatever it is that's spoken at home. Versus if you don't start learning a new language until you get to junior high or high school, it becomes harder for you to pick up on those nuances and those intricacies, and you begin to be more pedantic about how you understand them. Thus, when children pick up these ideas about racial differences and racial bias, they're just picking up on the nuances and the intricacies in our conversations every day. And so while we can't be perfect, we do have to really be mindful of when we make comments about certain news stories or we make comments about certain people that we see out in the world, because our children are really looking at us. Biology really determines these critical early learning periods. And if we were talking about development during this talk, I would definitely bring up the fact that when we look at what Piaget says about cognitive development, as well as what Vygotsky often says about how children learn socially and social culturally, it's really important for us to realize that both of these theorists talked about children learning things as they began to conceptualize and construct the world around them. When we talk about it in terms of racial bias, as early as 6 months, a child's brain can really begin to notice race based differences, meaning they notice that people are different. They begin to look at one person and look at another person. If you've ever been around a baby this young, you notice that they kind of will just stare at you if you look different than many of the people who they are used to seeing around them. And that's because the baby's brain is trying to process those differences. By the time they get to be a toddler or moving into that preschool age, children can really begin to internalize racial bias. This is because children begin to see how other people are interacting with each other. So when you as a parent may interact with someone from a different culture or a different race differently, children begin to say, when someone looks like this type of person, this is the way to treat them. They haven't really began to understand racism or be racist towards people yet, but at this age, they're really starting to pick up how am I supposed to navigate my environment based on how my caregivers and the adults around me are acting. And so if you mistreat someone who looks different than you and your family, then children in this age bracket begin to think, okay, this is how I treat someone who looks this way. By the time children reach preteen age, many children become set in their beliefs. It really gives parents, at least at minimum, a decade to really mold that learning process. So that way children can have a better understanding of racial bias and racial differences and really can be able to incorporate differences in people's culture and people's language and people's racial identity. They can really begin to incorporate that into how they see the world. It doesn't mean that if you never talked about race before your child reached preteen age, that all is lost and they'll never learn. It just means that by the time they get to this age, they've already started to construct ideas and kind of spaces in their brain for how should I treat someone who looks this way or that way. So now let's move into the strategies for helping our children really deal with racial bias. We've talked a little bit about what happens to children and how they begin to talk about racial bias or understand racial bias by the time they're about 12 or 13 years old. And so let's talk a little bit about how to help them manage it as they move into working with people, going to school with different people, and living in a society with people who look different than them. First and foremost, it's important to realize that talking about race is not racist. It's really okay to talk about it, and it's so important too. The idea about racism versus talking about race is that racism has this undertone of prejudice and bias towards it. Racism really says, I think differently about you in a negative way because you look different than me. Simply saying to your child, people are different than us, and these are the ways that they're different, i.e., talking about race, it doesn't mean that you are creating a racist child. It means that you're helping your child be able to really conceptualize and understand why someone might look different than them. So that way they can kind of put that into their internal worldview of how to deal with people. From a young age, children definitely have questions about racial differences, and I feel like parents need to be prepared to answer them. And we'll talk about how to manage that yourself, parents, as we get into this talk a little bit more. But the idea is that when children are asking about racial differences, especially younger children, they're not saying that I am racist and I don't like that person. They're just saying, Mom, Dad, I'm noticing that this person is different than me. Can you tell me more about why they are? I've even been around children as young as 5 years old who will notice that they are white and their friend is brown, or that they're brown and their other friend looks like chocolate, right? Children are really trying to just understand their world around them, and they're not really picking up yet on how to discriminate or be prejudiced towards people, but what they're just noticing is someone looks different than me. So when we're looking at preschoolers and we're looking at how to talk to them, at this age, children, like I just talked about, may notice and point out differences in people around you. So you might be at the grocery store and your child might point to someone who looks different at the park, or maybe even if you bring them to work with you, they might notice that you have coworkers that look different. If your child asks about someone's skin tone, perhaps, you can say something like, Isn't it wonderful that we're all so different? You can even hold your arm against theirs to show them the differences in skin tone in your family. And I think this is so important for us not to be scared of these type of questions in our children, not to freak out and think, oh, my kid's racist, they're starting to notice color, but to really help them to feel like it's okay to notice differences. It's okay to notice that people do not all look the same. Some people are different colors, some people are taller or shorter, some people are thinner or wider, and all of these differences make us all really unique and really special. And I think, again, when we're talking about racial bias, and I'll get to this in a bit, it's so important that we don't allow our own life experiences with different races and different cultures to really change the way that we talk to children about this. A good example would be if your children ask again that this person has a different skin tone, you don't have to all write out, say, oh, those people are Latino, or these people are Chinese, or these people are this. You can really just begin to see what your child is noticing. I love asking kids, what do you notice about that person's skin, or that person's hair, or those person's eyes? Just to see kind of where your kid's mind is before you start jumping in and saying things like, well, this is what they do, and this is who they are, and this is what they eat. Children, especially at this age, might not be ready for that much information. And so, especially at this preschooler age or toddler age, you really want to be mindful of kind of where they are and how much they want to learn. You also want to be mindful of how much do they know and kind of what messages have they received already. And so this is why it's really good to ask your kid, what do you notice about people's differences? Do you have any friends that look like this at your school? Have you seen anyone who looks like this in your world? And they might say anything to, yes, I have friends this way, or teacher so-and-so looks like this, or the man who helps us with our lunch looks like this. And that's a really good way just to help them really see that people being different doesn't mean that you should treat that person differently. As children get older, the discussions can definitely get a little bit more complex. This is the age where it's so important to have open talks with your child about race, diversity, and racism. It's important for your child to understand all of these terms, especially as they're moving out of that elementary school space and into that junior high and high school space. Because children in that age, again, when I go back to that idea of cognitive development, by the time a child is about 12 years old, they've already got all the cognitive structures that they need to really conceptualize and understand their world. And so as they're starting to develop those cognitive structures and starting to understand what is this and how does this work in my world, it's important for us to give them really good definitions for what race is, culture, diversity, racism, prejudice, bias. That way they can start incorporating these words and these concepts into how they see the world and how they interact with people. You definitely want to discuss topics that will help your children see you as a trusted source of information on the topic. So that way your child can come to you with any questions. You always want to let them know that you will do your best to help them understand what's going on in the world, but there may be times when you might have to get outside support, or you might have to help them understand that maybe you and your child at the same time can research it together. I also think that especially as children get older, it's important to point out stereotypes and racial bias in movies and books, such as villains or bad guys in movies. I, for one, personally think that using movies and cartoons and media is a really great way to help our children understand really complex and nuanced kind of topics like racism and diversity and race. And so when we're looking at different things, it's so important to say, this is a stereotype about someone who looks like this. Do you know what the word stereotype means? And if they do, then to discuss it. And if they don't, still discuss it, right? A really good example is I've talked to so many kids from all walks of life and all racial identities about the movie Black Panther, that is a superhero comic book movie. And many kids talked about how important it was to see someone who looked different than them and was not white being the superhero and being the good guy. And so I think it's times like this that we actually have a lot more representation in media, and we can really use some of the cartoons and some of the TV shows that our children are already watching and really helping them to understand that sometimes people are shown a different way, even though that's not who they really are. And sometimes people are shown in so many different unique ways, and that's a great way to understand what someone might look like or who someone might be if they identify in a certain race. If your child begins to make comments or ask you questions about race based on maybe a school incident or something that they've seen, read, or watched, it's really important to ask questions and get curious first. Oftentimes, parents will say, my child asked me about this, and I'm worried that they're moving down this route or that they're going to be racist. And what I always tell my parents to do is to just really slow down and ask your child, how did you feel about that? What did you think? Do you remember how you felt when that was going on? Why do you think that happened, right? Do you understand what was going on in that moment? Really get curious about how your child processed that incident so that way you can understand the pieces that you need to kind of fill the gaps in for them. Or you can really figure out, okay, is this something that I need to really work with them on? Or I'm noticing that my child has a really good understanding of how this has worked. This is really helpful too if your child has heard something insensitive or if your child is starting to experience racial bias themselves. Oftentimes, children, because they're influenced by more things than just their parents, will often pick up on things that you never taught them, but they may have seen it in a TV show or maybe some of their friends may be talking this way. And so, again, being mindful that even if you're noticing your child starting to experience some of this racial bias or some of this prejudice, not to immediately get mad at them, but sit them down and try to understand, where did they learn that? Is that being helpful to them? Do they think that's a kind thing to say about somebody? And really start working on understanding your child's perspective and how they got there versus being punitive about it. Some other strategies that you can use too to have these discussions is to talk to your children and acknowledge that racial differences and bias do exist. Again, based on your child's understanding and their attention span, being mindful that this discussion will not be a one-time discussion, unfortunately, because things are always going on in the world and there's always kind of these opportunities to discuss racial differences because racial differences exist in their world. Just know that the first time you have this discussion, it will be a foundational discussion, and you'll probably have to keep talking about this over and over and over until your child is really old enough, maybe in their late teens, early kind of adulthood, until they're old enough to really understand themselves how to create their own perspectives and thought processes about racial bias and racial differences. Confront your own bias. This is so important, and I'll talk about this a little bit too, and model how you want your children to respond to others who may be different than them. We'll dive into this a little bit later, so I won't jump into this too much, but it's a very important part of really discussing racial bias and racial differences with your child. Also, encourage your child to challenge racial stereotypes and racial bias by being kind and compassionate when interacting with all people of all racial, ethnic, and cultural groups. Oftentimes, our own life experiences can change the way we interact with people when we're out in the world, but be mindful that oftentimes our children listen to what we do way more than what we say. And so while at home, you may be telling your child, this is how you're supposed to respect people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds, if you go out into the world and you don't do that yourself, kids might begin to think, I'm going to do more about what my parents do than what they say, that you're being really kind of contradictory based on how you're telling them one thing but acting another way. And so again, this isn't to make you feel bad or make you think, oh no, I've screwed up my child, but it's really to make you think, how do I interact with people who look different than me and my family out in the world? And do I need to make changes, or do I need to kind of update that so that way my child learns the proper way to support others who may look different than them? So now let's jump into how you can confront your own bias when you're dealing with this discussion and when you're having to manage this for your child. Before talking to your child, I think it's really important to face your own biases and learn biases, sorry, biases, and learn as much as you can about race and racism. I think by the time many of us have children, we have a healthy understanding of both race and racism, but we might not really be aware of where our biases came from or where we picked up these ideas about certain races and certain cultures. I feel like a lot of parents are really being forced into this space because of how the world is right now and the way things are going. There's so much going on in the world, and our children have access to it just like we do. They have access to the internet, they have access to YouTube, and so they may pick up on news stories or media events that maybe you weren't ready for them to pick up on, but it's happening and it's happening a lot. And so this can be a really tumultuous time for parents because you're kind of being confronted with their own biases on a daily basis. And so it's so important for you to give yourself permission to say, I need to do more reading on this and maybe we can figure it out and talk tomorrow. It is so okay for you not to have every single answer to all of your children's questions about race and racial bias. You can really let them know, I don't think I know enough about that. So let's figure it out together if they're old enough to be a part of that, or if they're not old enough to be a part of it, to say, what, let me think about it a little bit and I'll talk to you about that later on before bed or tomorrow when we have breakfast. And then really spend that time looking at why are these things happening and how can you explain it to your child. Some other strategies that include being a role model. So we just talked about kind of thinking about what are my own biases and how are they kind of showing up when I'm interacting with people. And I think it's really important for you to always be mindful of that. Be mindful of your own life experiences, not so that way you can ignore them and pretend like they never happened, but to really sit with yourself and say, wow, I've had this type of life experience with this type of race or this type of ethnic culture, and I'm feeling like I don't know how to talk about them in a positive way. There's nothing to be ashamed of with that. It just means that now you're aware and you can either decide to rectify it or work on yourself. So that way, when your children ask you about that particular identity, then you can be really mindful about what you say and how you're talking about it. I always tell parents that your everyday comments and actions will say more than anything else. And so it doesn't mean be perfect. It just means be mindful that children see us and follow that, what we do and what our actions are, way more than what we say sometimes. And oftentimes, children will follow what you say when they notice that you're not giving them a lecture, but you're just talking randomly about things. And so sometimes I'll tell parents a good way to be a good role model for your child is just to change your dialogue and change your daily conversations about the news, about politics, about certain things that you're noticing. That kind of helps children to conceptualize things differently. I also think having a wide, culturally diverse social network is so important for your child to see you interacting in a really colloquial and friendly way with people. If you always stay around the exact same types of people racially and ethnically, then your child never gets exposed to different races of people, different cultures, different social kind of experiences, because they never get to see anything outside of how they look and what their family looks like. And so encourage your child to do the same thing. If you notice your child has only friends of one type of ethnicity or race, maybe looking at whether or not that school or that social environment is really healthy for them. And if you can't move schools for whatever reason, thinking about how do I get my child into programs or how do I get my child into a social space where they get to kind of experience multicultural activities and they get to experience what it feels like to be around other types of people. You can travel and expose your children to other communities too. And I'll be really blunt, it doesn't mean traveling outside of your state or outside of your country. Oftentimes, many metropolitan areas have different kind of spaces or different kind of hubs that really encourage multicultural experiences and activities. So for instance, I'm from Southern California. And if you know anything about Southern California, it's kind of like a melting pot of culture. And so you can get food from different ethnicities. You can go to different kind of parts of Southern California and really immerse yourself in a certain culture. And again, I haven't even left my town to do that. And so just being mindful that there are so many different ways that you can expose your child to different communities and different cultures, going to museums, going to different events that might be put on in your community or in your town is really a good way, again, to expose your child to these activities and these experiences without really having to go to another country to do it. I would also say get involved with your school, your child's school, your place of worship, or your religious kind of spaces, and politics. It's important to know kind of what's out there and what these different spaces are teaching your child, so that way you can either support what's being taught, or you can kind of fill in the gaps if you feel like these spaces aren't really teaching your child what they need to know. There is a huge discussion and debate on whether or not the way children learn about American history is really good or not. And I think, again, at the end of the day, schools have their own agendas and they have their own kind of curriculums. But if you notice that your child's school curriculum is not teaching them about race and ethnicity and history in a way that's really giving them the full picture, be mindful of that and not really get throwing the baby out with the baby out with the bathwater, but really thinking, okay, the school has given them the good foundation. Let me kind of add my own flavor and add my own information into it. So that way your child can see the full picture of what is going on and how things look when we're talking about different races and different ethnicities. Now let's just talk in general about how do we talk about racial differences and racism? Because again, I think this is one of those topics that unfortunately we'll probably have to continuously have. And as your children get older, they'll ask you more questions or talk about things that maybe you didn't even think to address in the initial discussion that you had with your child. And so, first and foremost, you want to talk about what you know. Start by acknowledging what you already know, what your beliefs are. If you're aware enough of your biases, you can even talk to your child and say, you know, at one time I thought this, or at one age, at one point in my life, I thought this. Share with them any inequalities or any injustices you're noticing or seeing in the world, and asking them out whether they understand it or not. You can talk about your own lived experiences, of course, at age appropriate levels. If you've had really violent experiences with people of different races and ethnicities, I would say maybe save those discussions for maybe when your child is a little bit older and they've had a better foundation of what this looks like. I also think it's so important to talk about privilege on different levels. I think white privilege and cisgender privilege is something that's talked about quite a bit, but we often don't talk about socioeconomic privilege or religious privilege or even being able bodied and that being a privilege as well. And I think when we talk about all these different spaces, it allows our children to really internalize what privilege means and how they can be more effective in using their privilege positively than allowing them to grow up feeling resentful of their privilege and maybe even getting defensive when people talk about it. It's important that we understand how our privilege can be used positively as opposed to making us feel guilty or ashamed that we have privilege that other people don't have. It's important to talk about how these privileges may influence the way you think about things and the way your child thinks about things. And so it's important, again, just to talk about the things that you know as a really good foundation for helping your child understand just kind of what it is they should be aware of and they should know about. Doing research is important as well. I think we're seeing a lot more people getting into and diving into racial differences and racism and racial injustice and all the information that comes with that. I don't think you need to be an expert on all of these unless that is your kind of niche and that's what you do or that's what you teach about. But if it's not, it's important just to be informed. It's important to know that these things exist. And even if you don't know everything about them, maybe you don't even have to be the person that talks about it. Maybe you can do your research and realize there might be a webinar coming up or a talk coming up or somewhere that you can take your child or experience with your child together to get more informed. I'm a huge advocate of using our communities to learn more about things that are going on in our lives. And I know during kind of the COVID situation, it's difficult to get out and do things. But even in the comfort of your own home, you can join webinars, you can join kind of these virtual conferences, you can even do what you're doing right now with this, just learning about things and allowing other people who may be experts or thought leaders in the field to really help you and your family understand things as well. I also want to remind you, this is a learning process and journey. You will not get everything right while you're talking about it, and you will not have all the answers. But our children don't expect us to be perfect, but they do expect us to be aware of where we might be doing well and know what we're talking about. And they kind of expect us to say, okay, I don't know enough about this. Let's figure this out together. Both of those spaces allow you as a parent to really give your child the information they need and or put them in front of people who can give them the information. Be aware of what you don't know. I think we've talked about this quite a bit during this presentation, so I won't harp on it too much, but I will say this. It's okay not to know. It's okay to make mistakes and realize you didn't know everything about it. And it's even okay sometimes to be kind of unsure about whether or not what you're doing is right or wrong. Again, the idea is that you want to reassure your child that you'll look into it and see if you can learn together with your child. It's okay to say, you know what, I didn't make the best decision when we talked to so and so down the street, right? And so let's do a better job next time when we see someone who looks like that of not making a joke or not laughing and things like that. Again, it's not about being perfect. It's really about saying, I didn't know what I didn't know, and now I'm making a conscious, active choice to do better next time. I think it's also important to listen and encourage your child. What questions does your child tend to always ask when things come up about race or racism or racial injustice? What do they already know? And what are they kind of concerned about or worried about? Asking these questions first really allows you to conceptualize what do you need to do research on to make sure that you have the right answers for your child. Always think about sharing age appropriate and diverse kind of books and stories and movies about different societies, cultures, and ideas with your child. Again, like I said earlier in this presentation, we have kind of a great space right now where there's a lot more representation in our entertainment and our media than there has been in previous generations. And so really take stock of that and say, what can I show my child or read to my child that really exposes them to different types of people, different types of cultures, and different types of identities. So that way my children can begin to understand that when people are treated unfairly, what that means and why it's so important for us to speak up about these issues. Also, beware of your child's emotions. Oftentimes, when you talk about things like racial injustice or racial prejudice, or you talk about people being harmed because they look different than you, it can be really overwhelming for your children at any age. I mean, if we're being really honest, even as adults, it can be really overwhelming to continuously read or hear about all of this racial injustice happening in the world. And so, as you're having these discussions, really monitor how your child is feeling and really pay attention to their emotions. Think about after we've had these discussions, how is your child feeling? Are they feeling down? Are they feeling more empowered? Are they feeling more depressed? And really check in with them. Ask them, how are they feeling about these conversations? Do they need a break from having these conversations? Understand that just because we're talking about racial differences, it doesn't always have to be negative. You can really say, you know what? Maybe we've talked a little bit about racial injustice too much this week. Let's see something that's more uplifting and happy about racial differences and things like that. And being mindful of balancing these hard, intense discussions with discussions that maybe are a little bit more light and a little less intense. Again, you're not demeaning or dismissing racial injustice and racism, but you're giving your child a space to kind of take a break from it, and you're giving yourself a space. Even if you're part of the racial identity that's being oppressed and afflicted at the moment, it is still so important for you guys to manage your emotions and say, you know what, we've looked at enough news for the day, or we've looked at enough social media for the day. Let's get together and watch a movie or go outside and go for a walk and really just kind of get back to reminding yourselves that even though this is happening, it's not going to be fixed overnight, and we're probably going to have these discussions again. Also, at the kind of as we're wrapping up, really thinking about correcting misinformation. As you and I know as adults, there is so much misinformation and misperceptions about what's going on in the world right now. It's even more important for us to make sure that as our children begin to pick these up, that we really challenge those misconceptions and say, hey, that's not the right way to think about this. Let me tell you a better way to think about it. Or if you don't know what the alternative is, to look it up and see and say, I know what my child is saying or what's being said isn't right, but I don't know exactly what the alternative is or what is right. And be open to saying that. I know how we're doing things isn't the right way, so let's figure this out. Acknowledge what your child is feeling. And we just talked about this again, but I really think it's important to harp on it. Not just to monitor their feelings, but acknowledge their feelings. Encourage them to talk about their feelings with someone they trust, like you, or a teacher, or a friend, or even a therapist. Or you can use art and movement to help them really express how they feel. One of the things I love doing with children of any age, and I even do it sometimes with adults, is actually have people draw things or write things out when they don't really know how to articulate or say exactly what it is that they need to say. And so, again, if you're noticing that your child is having different feelings about some of the conversations that you're having, really giving them a space to express themselves, whether it be through talking, through moving, through drawing, through writing. It might even be, they might even want to play video games for a while and just kind of zone out. The idea is to acknowledge that they have these feelings and to support them in really processing and managing those feelings. Here are just some resources here that you guys can use. There are a million and one things out there about how to talk about racial bias and racism and racial differences with your children, but these are just some that I compiled specifically for you. You should have the PDF of these slides, and so the links are in that PDF, and you should either be able to copy and paste them into your browser or just to click on the links and get them. Lastly, I just want to say thanks so much for joining us. I hope that you will continue to listen in on these talks that the organization is providing for you. Also, if you want to talk more with me or connect with me in any way, here's my information, my email, my websites, and I'm also on Instagram as Diversity and Parenting INC. I hope that this has been enlightening for you. I hope that this has been helpful for you. And again, I hope that you will continue working on processing how this is for you and continuing to learn and grow. Thank you guys so much, and I hope to see you around. Bye.